So this panel session is actually goes right at the heart of I think the first order question that I think draws a lot from the previous presentation that we just heard from Kim, but also I think Dean's presentation as well. So we're really going to be discussing uh, the approaches to conceptualize and measure digital inclusion and women's economic empowerment. So these are the two fundamental concepts that I think is at the heart of what this conference is all about. It's about digital inclusion and women's economic empowerment, and how do we conceptualize these, and how do we measure them? And we already have started noticing that these are quite complex concepts. There are tensions between developing context specific measures and employing standardized tools that allow for cross context benchmarking. So I think these tensions, I think, have already been, kind of raised. And I think we will delve into some of those. We will be discussing primarily of two index. One is a Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index. This is extremely well known, and a new contribution, and it's a Digital Access and Use Index. It's sort of we'll also listen to that as well. So without further ado, I think we'll just move into the presentations, and let me introduce the presenters as they come to present. So I think the first presentation is going to be by Kalyani. She is with IFPRI. She's a research fellow in the Poverty, Gender and Inclusion Unit based in Delhi, India. And her research lies at the intersection of agriculture, gender, social protection, and public health and nutrition, with a specific focus on South Asia and Africa. She's going to be speaking about measuring the unmeasurable, matrix to capture women's empowerment. Kalyani, over to you.
Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me. And can you just raise your hand? Who should I be? Okay, great. So, thanks a lot for the invitation. I'm really excited to be here. It's my first time in West Africa, first time in Ghana. So, really looking forward to this. And what I'll be presenting is on the behalf of many colleagues at IFPRI, which is the International Food Policy Research Institute, who are working on gender and particularly on developing metrics to capture women's empowerment. Next slide, please. So I was really happy to hear that in every session today, we've talked broadly about the reach, benefit, empower framework. And so it's nice to see that already at this point, this is quite embedded in the way people think about this. But when we started the work at IFPRI of developing women's empowerment metrics, there were a lot of measures of reach and benefit. So if you're a programmatic intervention, reach, an example of a metric for reach would be the number of women who have received trainings or who have received agricultural extension. An example of benefit would be the number of women whose incomes have increased. But as we've discussed already several times today, neither of those gets you all the way to empowerment. So, with the increased income, are women able to take more decisions? Do they have more control over the income, or is that being expropriated by the men? And so on. And now the reach benefit empowered framework has actually been extended to include transform. And the transform component actually goes even beyond the level of the household to talk about shaping and changing social norms in the community. And so when we started this work, there was a lack of metrics to measure that empowerment component, which we really felt was central to be able to say, are agricultural development programs actually able to empower women? Next slide. So the importance of metrics really matter when they're able to motivate, monitor, and shape policy. And in particular, when they're able to give information to policymakers about what is working and what isn't working. So the metrics have a real tangible instrumental role to play in developing policies. Importantly, the elevation of women's empowerment to a standalone SDG goal has meant that we now very explicitly care not about women's empowerment because of its instrumental value, because it changes health or nutrition or children's education, but that we really value the intrinsic value of empowerment itself. And so it is elevated to a standalone SDG, but we also know that it underpins 12 of the 17 SDGs. So it's really central to everything that we do. Next slide. So then the question we ask is, do we really need specific metrics to measure women's empowerment? And for many, many years before IFPRI began this work, we were using a lot of proxies for this: age at marriage, assets brought to the marriage, women's education, wealth status, and so on. But the short answer is yes, because we know that women's empowerment is complex, it's multidimensional. And so when we use unidimensional proxies, they're only getting us part of the way there to be able to measure this kind of multifaceted concept. It's also important for projects that are implementing different kinds of interventions on the ground. And as I'll talk about the kinds of metrics that IFPRI has developed, you'll see that projects are able to kind of pick metrics off the shelf that suit their needs and that have been developed with projects like them. So they're very sort of conceptually grounded. And lastly, we all know that one of the ways to kind of influence or drive policy is to put hard numbers behind it, even though we also recognize strongly the value of qualitative work. And so it's important to have metrics to be able to measure these targets, because that's helpful in convincing policymakers who like to have hard numbers behind policy decisions. Next slide. So one of the things that we've been working on recently, and this is a paper that came out this year, is to just look at commonly used proxies of women's empowerment or unidimensional measures that get at one aspect of women's empowerment. And so in a paper that has come out in Social Indicators Research, we've looked at data from the Feed the Future Women's Empowerment in Agriculture surveys. And we've compared that with the large nationally representative DHS surveys. And what we show is that even despite efforts at harmonizing the samples, harmonizing the kinds of households women come from, harmonizing the way the measures were constructed, if you look at just a simple metric like decision making, which is a commonly used metric of women's empowerment, these can vary dramatically across countries, across surveys within the same country. And so you'll see Ghana is on the top left. And so comparing the Feed the Future surveys to the DHS surveys, you have really widely differing measures of women's empowerment. Next slide. And so what this brings us to is kind of a common way of measuring women's empowerment, and a way that is grounded in feminist theories, but also in mixed methods research. So it gets at that concept of having a standardized index, but one that is contextually adapted in the way that it's administered and the way that it's worded. And so this is the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index that was developed now more than a decade ago by IFPRI in collaboration with USAID and Oxford Policy and Human Development Initiative, OFI. And some of the really nice features of this draw on the multidimensional poverty index that preceded it. So it's additive and decomposable. So you can get a top headline number for the sample you're dealing with. You can also then break that headline number down into the components so you can see what's really driving disempowerment. But also interestingly, it draws on data from women and men in the same household. Because one of the key components of empowerment and measuring empowerment is that it is a relative concept. And so one part of the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index is what is known as a gender parity index that compares scores along 5 key domains for women and men in the same households. And the domains are production, resources, income, leadership, and time. Next slide, please. So since its development in 2012 and its validation and refinement with several projects in the Feed the Future surveys, the WEA has traveled widely. So this is the latest graph of all the countries where some version of the WEA has been piloted. I will make the caveat that if a country is shaded, it doesn't mean, of course, that this was implemented in a nationally representative survey, but that we have tested these in these contexts, and those tools and the translations and contextual adaptations are available. Next slide. So in addition to traveling widely, the WEA has also spawned a large number of offspring. So we started with the full Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index. We moved to an index that was shorter to administer and hence more nimble in the survey context. And then we developed an index, which I'll talk about in more detail, called the Project Level Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index, which had a whole bunch of optional add-on modules that, like I said, a project implementing, say, a livestock intervention or a market inclusion intervention could pull these metrics off the shelf and use them as needed. And then finally, where we've ended up now is for the women's metric, which is women's empowerment metrics for national statistical systems. And so think something like the DHS and embedding a short module into that. Next slide, please. So I'll talk quickly about two of the WEA offspring, and I'm happy to take questions about the others as well. Next. So the first of these is the Project Level Women's Empowerment in Agricultural Index, or the PRO-WEA as it's called. And this was developed under phase 2 of the Gender, Agriculture and Assets Program, or the GAP project, which had 13 agricultural development projects in South Asia and Africa, which participated in kind of this metrics development exercise. And so what that meant was there were these initial formative discussions with projects where they talked about what kinds of metrics were important for them to be able to track progress over time. Those metrics were then created, tested in the field, validated, and refined. And what we ended up with is this ProWea that you see on the right-hand side here, which has three broad domains of intrinsic agency, instrumental agency, and collective agency, with 10 equally weighted indicators that were developed keeping these projects at the forefront. Importantly, since we've talked about qualitative and quantitative research, the ProWea comes with qual and quant protocols. And so part of the contextualization of these metrics is implementing the qualitative protocols to, for example, understand what do people actually mean by the term empowerment. Next slide. So the advantages of the project level WEA, it has the same level of granularity as the overall WEA, but a slightly different lens. But the optional add-on modules and kind of the off-the-shelf aspect of it means that there's a great deal of user flexibility. So there's a core set of modules that allow for comparability across projects, but then you can also pick and choose modules depending on the project that you're implementing or that you're evaluating. Importantly, like I said, these were developed with the projects, and so they're collaboratively and contextually grounded in metrics that really matter to implementers. Next slide. One of the great advantages of the ProWea metrics is that they allow for inter-project comparisons. So what I'm showing here is on the left-hand side, we have the GAP2 projects. So these were the agricultural development projects that helped develop the ProWea and its indicators. On the right-hand side, we have another portfolio of 4 projects that comes under the Joint Program for Rural Women's Economic Empowerment, or JPRV. And here we have summary indicators of the impacts of the interventions that were conducted within the constituting agricultural development programs, and what those impacts have, what we see as impacts on women's empowerment status, empowerment scores, men's empowerment status, and so on. And so I won't go into the details because there are 2 papers underlying this which really talk about the interventions being developed. But what you can see this allows us to do is we're using the same metric for both portfolios of projects. For example, we can see that under the GAP2 agricultural development projects, a lot of the programs had null impacts on women's empowerment status, whereas under JPRV, a lot of the programs had really positive impacts on women's empowerment status. And that allows you to then delve deeper to say what were the kinds of project strategies or project platforms that were used in the 2 different projects that might have made the gender transformation more intentional. Next slide. The next sort of offspring of the WEA that I want to talk about is women's, which is the Women's Empowerment Metric for National Statistical Systems. And this was envisioned as a short version of the women's empowerment metrics that could be embedded as is into nationally representative surveys, so like the DHS, for example. So it is a survey-based direct measure. Compared to the WEA, which takes about 45 minutes, this one is short. It takes between 13 to 20 minutes, on average 15. It continues to be aligned with the SDGs, and similar to the WEA, it's counting based and decomposable, so it can be added up and then broken down. So you can really diagnose which are the portions where the women's empowerment indicators need more work or more attention. Next slide. So similar to the ProWea, this also has multiple domains and various indicators within those domains. So intrinsic agency, or what is known as power within. So this talks about self-efficacy, attitudes towards women's freedom in livelihood choices, and so on. Instrumental agency, which is probably the form of agency that we're most familiar with. And this talks about time allocation, your decision making over spending, and how much influence you have there. Collective agency, because a lot of programs now in South Asia and in Africa are increasingly using women's groups. These could be microfinance groups or other kinds of groups. So here we develop a little bit more about what does participation in a group organization or a collective organization mean for empowerment? And then lastly, the addition is on agency enabling resources. So here would be things like the use of information and communication technologies, the use of financial services and digital financial services, which is the focus of this program, and also secure property rights. Next slide. Okay, so this is my last slide. So just to talk about what's coming up next. So over the decade where IFPRI began this work, it really started from the principle that if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And by managing it, we mean being able to track it, monitor progress towards it, identify which project strategies really work to improve empowerment and which don't. And so now we've reached a point where we are able to measure at least some aspects of women's empowerment. So we would encourage projects in this room. If you have an upcoming project that where it looks like the ProVEA might be useful, we would encourage you to use it. There is a VEA help desk, which is always available for any questions you have, but we also have a website where you can download questionnaires, CAPI programs, do files, everything that you would need to be able to implement this. It's also important for us to embed the women's data in large national statistical efforts in order to be able to talk about scaling and impact. And so now IFPRI is working closely with country level national statistical agencies to really embed that short questionnaire into survey efforts that they're conducting so we can say something about country level measures. And then finally, we have a large number of emerging issues. These issues will continue to morph and change as we go ahead. So climate change, for example, is a big emerging issue and women's role in decision making within that. Collective action, like I said, there's more and more focus on groups and collective organizations and digital financial tools. So these are constant areas of innovation. I just want to say that the door is open. You know, if we are no longer holding on to the mantle of creating these empowerment indicators. Please go ahead and develop indicators that work for your projects. We'd love to hear your feedback and we'd love to hear how these metrics work for you. So a shout out to our funders who generously supported this work over the last decade or more. I'll just point you to the information at the bottom. So if you want more information on these indicators, there is a website where you can use a guide to decide which indicator works best for you. All of the supporting information, questionnaires, and everything is available there. And for those of you who are interested in taking a learning course, there's a self-paced, self-guided distance learning course on the ProVEA, which is also freely available and is now available in multiple languages as well. So we'd encourage you to use these and to reach out with us with any questions. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks a lot, Kalyani. So we have about 10 minutes allocated for any Q&A. So maybe we'll take two or at best three questions so that Kalyani has some time to respond to them. So the floor is open if you have any questions. There's one there. Anybody else? Two. Okay, please.
An example is the USAID. They were running similar projects called the Ring 2, Resilience in Northern Ghana System Strengthening, which was to empower women through nutrition and livestock. But unfortunately, the stop work order from the US government halted the project. Yeah. So sustainability is an issue. Other colleagues CSOs here can testify to that. So my question is, how do you sustain your project?
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sir.
All right, thank you very much. My name is John from University of Cape Coast, and thanks for the presentation, very insightful, but the practitioners permits me to shift a little bit to theory. So whatever I'm going to ask may not make sense to you, but I think you will appreciate it. I have a little bit of concerns. How is this metrics taking care of the nuances? I remember from the afternoon's the first lecture from Dean, right? How complex it is to actually appreciate true empowerment, right? And again, it also appears to me that part of the conceptualization and the theoretical underpinning of framework, it still lends itself to the liberal feminist position, which you and I know that it changes nothing at best to take us to access, and we'll be doing access, which is very basic when it comes to empowerment. When are we going to get to the conscientization, a high level of empowerment? So it becomes a little bit messy, right? We'll be using agency, but it appears the conceptualization is different. So there's the need to situate this again into the radical feminist theoretical position, who are the true owners of empowerment, and not as we have it from the liberal tradition, who will be talking about access,
Great.
which
Thank
is
you.
changing nothing.
Thank you. Any other question? Okay, we'll take those two. Kalyani, I think those are clear. One on sustainability and one on, are we getting trapped in terms of, on the asset side and at a very liberal feminist framework rather than a more radical one. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Is this working? Can you hear me? Okay, excellent. So thanks, Abu. I think that's a really important question, particularly in the financial climate that we're in right now. I will just say that the ProVia metrics can be used in any project. So the metrics themselves are not intrinsically sustainable, but they can be used. They were developed in the context of USAID projects, but they've been used now by more than 60 projects more than 200 projects in 60 countries, and those are ranging from small projects which are funded by grants such as the grants given here to government supported projects. So the spectrum is wide. The metric is just a tool to be able to measure women's empowerment within those contexts. So, really grateful to the funding that came from USA to help develop and refine those metrics. So that was the initial pilot phase. And without that support, I think this effort would have died in the water. And so we're fully acknowledging that. But now the metrics are there for anyone to use. So if you're implementing a small project in your country, in a small geographical region, those metrics are available for you to take off the shelf and translate and use. So in that sense, it is designed to be fully open access and public use. And hopefully that will help in encouraging the sustainability. To John's question, yeah, excellent question. In order to capture the nuances, I think I'll point you to the paper that talks about the development of the indices, but there was a lot of work that went into sort of interplay of qualitative and quantitative methods. And so there was formative qualitative methods. For example, just a definition of the word empowerment and what defines whether a woman is empowered or not. In Bangladesh, it might be a woman who listens to what the men in her community say, which is a very different concept of empowerment than what we might assume. And so just being able to contextualize, even use the words that are understandable by respondents. There was a process of cognitive interviewing, and there are several papers that are available on that. So when you ask a question, is your respondent understanding what it is that you're asking? So a lot of work went into kind of capturing the nuances. And even now, if you're implementing the ProVia, we recommend that you do a combination of qualitative and quantitative work. And then in terms of moving beyond assets, maybe that wasn't fully clear in the presentation, but we fully support the movement beyond assets, which is why we have those three different domains. So the instrumental domain is a domain we're most familiar with. So that is resource control, control over income, time agency, and so on. But there is that intrinsic domain, which is the power within. So things around autonomy in income decisions, self-efficacy, other aspects of empowerment that are not around assets and control over resources. And then, of course, the collective domain as well. So I agree that there's more that can be done, and we do need to move beyond that asset focus. But I hope that we're getting at least part of the way there. Thank you.
Okay, we'll move to the next presentation. Let's give a round of applause. Okay, so the next presentation, I think, is online. Is everything ready online? Okay, so it's a presentation by Amnesty LeFevre. She is going to be presenting. She's associate professor at the School of Public Health and Family Medicine in the University of Cape Town. Her work explores the cost, differential reach and impact of digital innovations on development and health outcomes. And it's the title is Optimizing Measurement of Women's Access to and Use of Technology in Mobile First Population. So over to you, Amnesty, for the presentation. Thank you.
And thanks so much for that lovely introduction. I want to note that I'm joined by my colleague Mayank, who works with our team from also including Johns Hopkins University. So the two of us will be speaking for the next 10 or so minutes. So thank you very much for indulging us. So Mayank and I are pleased to be here today to speak on behalf of our larger consortium from the University of Cape Town, Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, and our colleagues in India from Oxford Policy Management and the GXD Hub. As Imran kindly mentioned, the focus of our talk will be on a digital access and use index, which our team has been working to develop as a way of reconceptualizing how we measure the digital gender gap to extend beyond traditional parameters of phone ownership and internet use. And this work is being conducted as part of two separate investments from the Gates Foundation, which endeavor to harmonize measurement of digital access and use across domains of access, digital competency, safety, security, digital agency, and social and gender norms. Next slide. To improve the, Mike, really good, thanks. So to improve the measurement and metrics for assessing digital access and use at a population level, we followed the 5 steps basically depicted on this slide. We started with item generation and catalog definitions, domain survey questions that are currently used to measure key components of digital access and use. And we then had a series of expert consultation workshops and one-to-one meetings to refine items in the proposed strategy for measurement. This has fed into a process of feasibility, reliability, and validity testing, which has included sort of both secondary analyses and primary data collection. Cognitive testing, has been a big part of that effort. And to date, we've done cognitive interviews in India, Kenya, and Nigeria. In contrast to this prior presentation, which we heard, our index is at its infancy. So we haven't yet deployed across 200 countries, but hopefully at some point in the future we'll be there. But for the sake of today's conversation, Mike and I are going to be focusing on the primary data collection efforts, and in particular, the recently completed survey across the Indian state of Bihar. The data for this is serving as the foundation for the initial index creation, although we're anticipating added work to further refine the items proposed for inclusion. Next slide. In late March, our team finished the fieldwork component of a 10-district survey across the Indian state of Bihar. For those of you unfamiliar with Bihar, it's India's second most populous state and among its most disadvantaged in terms of human development indices and gender inequality indices. Just for context, about 30% of women in our sample were able to read a sentence as a proxy for literacy, if that gives you a sense of kind of where things fall. As a result of kind of its current status, Bihar is one of the Gates Foundation's priority estates, along with Uttar Pradesh. And so our survey really sought to bolster sort of how we're measuring digital access and use, and also sort of generate primary data which could be used to inform programming in that state. We had a secondary aim which sought to measure differences among women enrolled in self-help groups and those not. And of course, the quantitative survey was followed by post-survey qualitative research in a subset of 2 districts. So for today's presentation, we're going to just give you a snapshot of where we are in terms of developing an index drawing from that quantitative indices. Next slide. The quantitative survey itself included nearly an hour of questions across the domains of digital, comprised of domains related to connectivity, physical access, and affordability. And we've included illustrative items here that were captured in that. The survey included in a larger expansive list, but this gives you a snapshot. We additionally measured digital competency, including over 65 different skills. A subset of 31 of these skills map back to DigComp's 5 competency domains. As part of the digital skills assessment, we also explored the reliability of reported versus observed digital skills and the reported ability to perform skills alone or with assistance. In terms of safety and security, we included a limited set of items in the quantitative survey in Bihar, but we have a broader bank of questions related particularly to harms that could be used in other settings. And then next, you'll note domains on social and gender norms, including descriptive and injunctive norms and attitudes related to phone use, internet use, phone ownership, and the use of phones for financial transactions. Finally, digital agency was included based on responses to questions on decision-making, permissions, restrictions, and constraints. Not depicted here on the slide, but measured in the survey are a range of other outcome measures on women's economic empowerment and the use of phones for high-impact use cases, including agriculture, health, education, and other forms of economic generating activities. Next slide. So the index was derived from a cumulative score that is assigned to respondents based on reported values across domains. We've proposed two methods for deriving it. The first, and the one we've used to date, is a data-driven approach where we look at patterns and associations through a statistical lens. The second is an approach where we'll engage experts in the field using a Delphi process and aim to reach consensus on a refined set of items and relative weights for those items. You'll see in the slides to come that this latter approach is our next phase and likely ideal for deriving an index that is more globally applicable to a range of contexts. And for generating information useful for program design, evidence generation, and informed decision making. Next slide. So the current index is based on a 29-point scale, which gives the largest valuation to two domains. Just a note here, the current components of the index that Mayank had in the last slide are, these are the items that were included from the Bihar data after dropping items with low variance or poor loading. So it's a subset of larger questions within this. Next slide. Great. So the current index is based on a 29-point scale, which gives the largest valuation to two domains, so access and digital competency. Because of time limitations, we're going to focus on these two domains predominantly in the slides to come, and give an overall picture of the performance of the score across all of these domains, and highlight some potential use cases for its use. Next slide, Mike. So as noted in kind of the prior slide, the access score includes four components. Phone ownership, denoted sort of by A here, phone type, B, phone condition, and the periodicity of access. So that includes, times during the day that you had it. And for all of these, we tested alternative ways of phrasing these questions quantitatively. And then, of course, this work was born out of an extensive qualitative phase. But for the sake of what's included in this access score, it's a multiplier of phone ownership times phone type. And then, it adds in the condition of the phone, a score for the condition of the phone and the periodicity of access, giving obviously a greater weight to different components within this. So two things that the slide tells us. One is that, the score is derived as this multiplier of A times B plus C plus D. And then second, we see the individual distribution of responses based on the data from Bihar. And here the pink denotes women's responses and the blue men's. And so what we're seeing from this is not surprising, perhaps. We see that a higher proportion of men, if we look at that first sort of bar in terms of the phone ownership, we see that a higher proportion of men at 84% versus 54% of women own their own phone. If we look at phone type, we see that, not surprisingly, men have better sort of quality of phone in terms of higher smartphone ownership. They have more functional devices in terms of sort of the condition of the phone, and that was assessed through three different subparameters of whether the phone could hold the charge, how the quality of the screen, whether it was cracked so severely that you couldn't decipher text on the slide, on the screen, and then of course the functionality of the keypad. So ultimately what we see from this again is there continues to be a gender gap in overall sort of access and the quality of access between men and women. And, the score ultimately considers, the sort of multiplier in addition of this item to generate that access score. Next slide. The last domain that we wanted to deep dive in is digital competency. And in particular, we've done a definition of competency that focuses on digital skills score component. And we originally sought to sort of this based on the IT digital skills indicator, which includes 31 questions from our larger subset of 65 different skills. However, we realized that 31 questions for most programs is infeasible to measure. So we sought to streamline this down to a core set of essential skills, which presently sits at around 15. And these are depicted here on the slide. These are assessed based on self-reporting. And here what we see from the data in Bihar, again, with women in pink and men in blue, is perhaps unsurprising. Men have double the digital skills score as women, and and a higher proportion are able to perform not only sort of basic skills such as making an outbound call, but more complex skills needed to support high impact use cases like searching the internet or making financial transactions. So with a snapshot of kind of these two domains of access and skills in mind, I want to hand it over to Mayank, who's going to discuss the broader performance of the full range of factors in the index and give a few examples of how we might use it. Mayank, over to you. You're on mute, Mayank.
My apologies. Is this better? Yeah. Okay, so the distribution of the digital access and use scores shows a bimodal distribution. So as you can see in this graph, the x-axis over here is the distribution of the scores from 0 to 29. It's a 29-point scale. And we see that there are two distinct groups that emerge amongst men and women. So one group is at the lower end, where we see that men and women show similar patterns in the distribution, but there is a distinct gender gap that emerges amongst people in the higher DAC scores, which shows that the men have a higher use and access score compared to the women. So if we stratify the scores further by the type of phone that people have access to, the distribution of men is similar for feature and basic phone users, but we see a gap emerging amongst smartphone owners. This is partly a function of the way the score was created, of course, since the phone type also contributes to the score, but we'll talk about separating that in a second. But first, as a validation check, the DAU score is able to discriminate well and as expected between different groups of age, education, and literacy. So we see that higher, people with higher education tend to have higher scores, which is what we would expect. Now, coming to how we use this index, currently what we've demonstrated is using the index as a continuous variable to identify patterns of access and use amongst any population. We can separate out the access and use components, which yield some interesting insights, like how removing physical access barriers alone is not enough, which we'll talk about in a moment. And the score can also be used as a measure for outcomes. Going forward, implementing this index in future studies would likely reveal interesting comparisons over time, geographies and populations, and those results would likely inform program decisions, design, resource allocations, and advocacy. So the DAU index is created by grouping the populations into three levels based on the scores. So we have the low, medium, and high bin for each of these individuals. And this is useful to explore the profile of a target population. So in this case, we wanted to see who are the respondents in Bihar that fall into the highest level of digital access and use. And what we see is that these are usually individuals under the age of 40 who are literate and in a higher SES strata, and who own smartphones. So on the topic of smartphones, we decided to break out digital access and digital use. So here, instead of a 29-point scale, we are exploring only the 18-point component, which is composed of skill, safety, and the agency scores. So the distribution that we're looking at here is for smartphone owners. So these are the people who have the highest level of access, that is, they report ownership of their own phone, and the phone that they have is a smartphone. So theoretically, they cannot get any better access to technology than this. But we still observe that there is that same distinct gender gap where men tend to have higher level of skills and agency. And what this tells us is that it's not enough to give women access to smartphones, but that there is an underlying systemic factor that governs how that phone is used and the level of skill they develop from it. So coming to outcome measures, how the score corresponds to certain use cases that we measured in our survey in this graph. The blue lines show the men's prevalences and the pink lines show women's prevalences. And the dots on the lines are for each level of the index. So we see the expected trends where people with higher levels of access show higher use prevalence in most cases. Notably, the largest gender gaps were seen in economic-related use cases, which includes online transactions, use of mobile banking, mobile money, as well as use for government and agricultural uses. So the index can be used as a covariate in regression analyses. One example that we presented here is looking at a logistic regression to identify determinants of women having a savings account in Bihar. Now, these are not prevalences. These are predicted probabilities based on the logistic regression. So what we're looking at is the digital access as a covariate for the digital access index, which shows that someone falling in a higher category has a 56% predicted probability of having a savings account when controlling for all of the variables. So this outcome shows that having a higher access and use of technology correlates with higher odds of a woman having a savings account. So that's how the index can be used as a covariate. And yeah, back to you, Amnesty.
Thank you so much, Mike. So just to kind of summarize this, I know we're at time. What we've seen kind of from this first effort at creating a broader digital access and use index is that its current composition discriminates well and as expected across demographic and access groups. A key finding from this data is it tells us that giving access to kind of smartphones, as Kim and others have suggested before, alone is not sufficient to close a sort of gender gap, particularly in skills and agency. Currently, we have 29 questions in the index, but the goal from, at least from the Gates Foundation side, is to get this down to around 10. So you could see, sort of, we're going to have to undertake a sort of follow-up processes, and the intent is to do that through sort of a Delphi approach, as well as in-person consultations, to sort of get consensus on what that final kind of, 10 or so questions should look like. So we look forward to your comments and thank you for your time today. Back to you.
Some questions. The floor is open. I can see 1, 2. And anyone else? Okay, please.
Thank you very much. A very interesting study. I have two quick questions. One, I realize you sampled more women than men, but you didn't explain why. Why did you do so? Then two, I tend to have a problem with access when you define access also as sharing, because the two, if I own a phone and if I'm sharing, the outcomes are different. So were you able to disentangle or separate the two in your analysis to see whether they get different outcomes?
Was the question audible?
Yes, thank you so much. So I'll just sort of briefly take a stab, and Maya can also jump in. So to the first, sort of question on sampling. So we sampled basically one of the objectives that I highlighted was to sample women that are part of these economic empowerment groups called self-help groups. So our sampling, sort of did try to accommodate, sort of self-help group. So, for that reason, our sample of women is slightly larger, but we are powered at a population level to look at differences, across men and women overall. The other reason why the population for men is slightly lower is that, our interviews were conducted during the day, and so we were sort of dependent upon a man being in the household at the time of the interview. The other, sort of related to that is that this is a context where there is some degree of outward migration out of the state for employment. So I don't know, Mike may know offhand what proportion of men in that sort of category were not physically in the state for those reasons. But yeah, so that explains some of the gender differences in the total sample size, which I think at the end for men was around just over 5,000, and for women 7,000 and change, I think. In terms of the second question on phone sharing and versus phone ownership, it's interesting you said this. We've done quite a lot of work, sort of trying to understand conceptualizations of what is a phone owner and how that's defined across different surveys. I would say in the Indian context, and there are contexts elsewhere in South Asia where this is relevant. the concept, there's quite a high prevalence of phone sharing. And so, we can restrict the sample to only focus on, a score generated based on ownership. But, for the Indian context, there is this nuance where a lot of women do have, a lower grade, sort of quote unquote access, where it's not, they don't own, but they may have access to a phone that they share with their husband for certain segments of the day. Mike, do you want to add to anything that I've said?
Only that, yeah, we have done extensive work, especially in the Indian context. There's also a concept of what we explored as prime ownership. It's not included in this index, but what we basically disentangled here was for some people, even if they owned the phone or they reported ownership of the phone, they were not the main users of the phone. So, for example, a woman might say, "Oh, yes, it's my phone, but my son uses it most of the time." So there are those nuances that we also have data on, and that we're still exploring. Yeah.
By the way, I think we really struggled with, trying to limit it down to certain numbers of questions. And so I think just on Mike's point on prime use amongst phone owners, we dropped down about 6%, in terms of the proportion of phone owners that are not the prime user. So even amongst that category of a quote, self-identified owner of a phone, they may not be the prime user. So you have these gradients where it's going to be imperfect to try and capture it, and we can layer in more questions to get a more nuanced definition. But a lot of surveys can accommodate that. So happy to discuss additionally.
Thank you once again. I think partly Michael tried to address some of part of my question about the nuances, still on the nuances. And I must say it's very insightful to have such a metrics and all of that. But I think going forward, it should be a little bit more robust and complicated, right? But I was asking myself, okay, so what does it mean to be a single person, a younger person, and a richer person? And what would that mean for access? So I'm bringing the whole idea of intersectionality. So it's not enough to just hold the other demographics constant and run the model and say that our age is in a regression model is significant, and it's not enough. We want to see how, for instance, age is intersecting with the income status of the person. So how would access affect, for instance, somebody who is richer and younger? You see, the dynamics will change. So it's just a suggestion in playing with a model, a way to make it more nuanced. I'm suggesting you apply the lens of intersectionality and not hold the demographics variables constant and be running to find which one is significant, but rather see how they intersect with each other to bring about other nuances and experiences in terms of the access to phones.
Okay, thank you. Let's see if there's any other question. Otherwise, we'll ask for a response. Anyone else? Okay, if then I will maybe ask a question about, I mean, this has been, you have developed this in the context of Bihar. So I was just wondering, what type of adaptations you think would be needed if we were to generalize this or use this in other contexts. So that would be a question from my side. Please.
Just on, to the first gentleman's point, I think, Mike, if you can go down to the slide on the first one on use on the score, it has, so we, sorry, I think it's like 16. No, go up. 15, sorry, go to 15. So I agree, it's important to sort of consider intersectionality across other sociodemographic characteristics. There's lots of ways of sort of presenting, either a score or an index. This is sort of just a snapshot of how you could look at a very, some of these factors that might sort of help us identify sort of, which particular groups have differentials in that score. To the first gentleman's point, there's lots of different ways to do this, and we have the data on it as well to come up with a sort of more comprehensive assessment depending upon the outcome that's of interest of, kind of using a range of demographic characteristics plus the, in the index within that, and then sort of regressing that onto different outcomes of interest. the second point on, sort of context-specific adaptations, I think where we're headed is in a similar, hopefully, is in a similar direction that the prior presenter, sort of also sort of articulated, which is that there will be a set of guidance to support context-specific adaptations. We've gone through sort of a very robust process in terms of, getting the question phrasing, quote unquote, right, at least for Hausa language in Nigeria, Kiswahili in Kenya, and in Hindi in India, and currently are quite confident that the index that we have would work well, at least in terms of comprehension of questions across those kind of four settings. In terms of the components of the score, I think our next phase of just sort of making sure that the items speak to a broad range of contexts will have to sort of be revisited through these sort of series of expert consultations that are planned. And, much in the same way that the prior speaker articulated kind of a 10-year process, I think we're in the infancy of that journey. And I think in terms of technology use, things are changing quite rapidly. So it's always a challenge to try and sort of match where the moment is, with also having kind of stretch goals. So Mike, if you go to the digital skills slide just for a second, I think, part of the big sort of challenge we're trying to sort of face is how do you ready this index for something that is longitudinally sound, given the pace at which technology is changing. If we sort of can conceptualize a place where the physical access to device barrier may be limited, as sort of the cost of smartphones decreases, as sort of more and more individuals are able to sort of get their own phones and the quality of those phones increases, we anticipate that current components of the use will play a stronger role in this. And one of the challenges we have, specifically given its current weighting within the index, is getting the right mix of digital skills that are sort of relevant to a range of populations, particularly mobile first low income country settings. So here as an example is a snapshot of 15 skills. The ITU has 31 questions that we've helped phrase for them and have gone through sort of an expert consultation process. But, again, already we're at 15 questions. So sort of trying to capture even the full range of their indicator is likely infeasible, at least for most of the Gates Foundation's grantees. So it's always a sort of trade-off of trying to have a score that can be widely used with one that can meet the divergent needs of varied contexts. So ultimately, what we'll end up having is a longer indices and a longer bank of questions that individuals can draw from, as well as sort of a minimum core set of questions that probably number between 10 and 15. And that process, again, will be born out of, a further refinement process that we're undertaking presently. Happy to answer additional questions and also have thoughts and guidance if people have suggestions. Over.
So we've had two very interesting and promising presentations on indicators. The women's we and then this one, which is on digital access and use. The next presentation is actually slightly different. I mean it's experimental study. So I would like to invite Scott Graham from FINCA International. So Scott leads the research and data science team at FINCA International. It's a global nonprofit that is fighting to end poverty through inclusive finance. And the title of the presentation is Adapting and Validating We Indicators in an Experimental Study of Savings. So in many ways, it's an application of some of the previous two presentations we basically saw. So let's listen to the presentation. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Quick mic check. Is this on? Yes, good, thanks. Quick question. How many of you consider yourselves either actual or aspiring data nerds? Quick show of hands. Okay, very small number. This is going to be interesting. Yeah, aspiring. That's why I added aspiring. I'm an aspiring data nerd myself, so I can relate. So a few years ago, FINCA published the results of an experimental study of in Uganda, and in our study, sorry, you can go forward one slide. Thanks, just that one there. So in our study, we were testing whether simple financial coaching delivered through phone and text messages could improve the use of savings accounts in Uganda. And among our findings, we were happy to see that, as hoped, coaching did in fact increase savings account activity, including the use of banking agents. And even though this was not a gender-focused study, we also found that some of the most robust effects were observed among women, with nearly a doubling of account transactions with even one coaching call. So we followed this up with some deep qualitative conversations with women so that we could understand what were all of the factors that influenced their savings activities and what did the end result of that mean in their lives. And these conversations drew our attention very strongly towards the challenge of empirically measuring women's empowerment. And so with the support of BRAC, we did a follow-on study. And the follow-on study, which I'm going to discuss today, is quite different. It is not actually an experimental study. Our goal was to adapt a set of WE indicators to the specific context of women's savings in Uganda. Every word of that is important. And then to statistically validate those indicators, the indicators themselves, through their correlation with actual savings behavior. In other words, we were trying to find, out of all of the possible WE indicators, what are the ones that actually had some kind of empirical relationship with observable savings behavior. So in the aforementioned qualitative phase, and you can go forward just one click, thanks, stop there. We adapted our battery of WE indicators through a series of focus group discussions and cognitive interviews. So the WE constructs that we started off with are all ones that you would be very familiar with in the literature, such as household decision making, gender norms, access to digital services, financial literacy, et cetera, et cetera. But our task in the first stage of our study was to express those indicators in terms that were meaningful to the women in our study. And the end result of that was a set of 80 WE questions that had been adapted to the context of our study. Next slide, please. So here are some quick insights and examples from that content validation stage, which is the first stage of our study. So first, we observed that many general WE constructs needed to be detailed out to a much greater degree in order to be meaningful for women in the context of their savings activities. So for example, when we asked them whether their husband or spouse was restricting their social activities in any way, they were very quick to point out that there were other family members besides the spouse who could be just as problematic, citing in-laws and other members of the extended family. So these kind of adaptations, pretty, we expected them, they're normal, but there were also two takeaways that really challenged our thinking and that had a big influence in the way that we structured our validation exercise. The first one, and I think this has already been mentioned a couple times this morning, was that almost all of our women's empowerment features, they were positive in some contexts and negative in other contexts. Even something like decision-making power had negative connotations if it came with additional financial responsibilities. Or privacy, which we might, logically assume is a positive feature. In some instances, it had connotations of secrecy, lack of trust, etc. So we came to think of this as bipolarity, right? Meaning that all of the WE features were positive for women in some circumstances, but negative in others. Another insight we had was that in addition to being bipolar, there was a real issue of bidirectionality, meaning that in many cases, the women's empowerment condition would determine the savings outcome, and in other cases, the savings outcome would influence the women's empowerment condition, right? There is no clear direction of causality. It was really bidirectional. So we say that women's empowerment and savings were very entangled. Now, these are very easy to intuit. I don't think anybody's shocked by these particular insights, and they're very well suited to exploration in a qualitative study. But we were trying to do a quantitative statistical validation of the indicators themselves. So it was a big challenge for us to figure out how we could encompass both the bipolarity and the bidirectionality in our statistical validation model. And I'm going to talk about how we did that. So if you can go forward. Yeah, so here are some of the basic elements of our study. So with BRAC support, we recruited 1,500 women into a goal-based savings account in Uganda. 50% of them were also exposed to a financial coaching regimen by phone. Now, I have to pause and say, we were not trying to test the efficacy of financial coaching for women's savings or empowerment. We were testing the hypothesis that coaching, which we had already observed in our previous study, had disproportionate effects on women. We wanted to see if coaching also enhanced the observable relationship between women's empowerment and savings. It's a nuance, but it's one important because we're not trying to prove whether coaching is effective. We're trying to prove whether it changes or in some way enhances the relationship between the empowerment indicators and the savings outcomes. So we incorporated our 80 content validation features into our We survey, and we analyzed those results together with data from their savings accounts over the course of about a year. Now, one very important aspect of our study is how we handled the data, keeping in mind that we didn't want to assume any kind of causality and we didn't want to impose any values. And so one way that we achieved that neutrality is that for every one of the answer options in our survey, we converted them into binary variables. So for example, if we asked a woman if she felt comfortable expressing her opinion in public, there were 3 possible answers: not comfortable at all, somewhat comfortable, very comfortable. We didn't assign those values 1, 2, and 3. Each one of them was treated separately as a binary variable with a possible value of either 0 or 1. Okay, this means that all of our we features were able to live independently without us imposing any kind of value on which one was better than another. But what the effect of that is that it took our 80 questions and expanded it into a set of 375 independent we features that we're going to go into our validation model. Now, we removed all of the ones that had low levels of variance, and so that brought us down to about 230 we features that we were actually putting into our statistical models. The last thing I'll mention is just the machine learning algorithms that we use. So we used 4 simultaneous methods: one lasso stability, 2 versions of random forest, and Baruta. I'm not going to go into those at the moment, but just to say that there were 4 simultaneous models running across, and then for each savings outcome, we picked the one that performed the best. Okay, so let's go forward. And here's a quick double click on what we mean by validating the indicators. So we were trying to identify which of our 238 we features were actually statistically correlated with observable savings outcomes. Okay, so what are those savings outcomes that we're comparing them against? So we adopted a model of savings that we think reflects financial agency. We borrowed it from other researchers that broke it down into 3 distinct outcomes. The first one was the ability to set a meaningful savings goal. So when a woman joined our study and said she was trying to save such and such amount, a year later, we tried to find out, is that amount still relevant? Is that still an important goal for you? The second was their actual ability to save towards that goal, which we observed through their savings account activities. Did they actually make concrete progress towards their goal? And then the third savings outcome was the ability to use those savings purposefully. Okay, everybody with me so far? Okay, so we can move on. All right, so here's a picture of the workflow that we used for selecting and validating our we features. Now, this is a pretty standard machine learning workflow. I'm not going to dwell on it too much. I'll just point out a couple of key features. So our sample we divided into two groups. We had our control sample and our treatment sample, treatment being the ones that received coaching. We set them aside, and then we did all of our statistical modeling and validation on the control sample. So we took 70% of the sample to train our models. And I mentioned that we used 4 because there was the lasso, 2 versions of random forests, and the Baruta. And then in the training data sets, each model produced a minimum level of features that predicted savings outcomes, the specific savings outcome in question, and then a maximum model. So we had 4 models producing 2 results each, so 8 altogether, which we applied across all 3 of the savings outcomes that I just spoke about. Then, once we had the feature set selected, we then validated them on the remaining 30% of our sample to see how our selected features performed against randomly selected variables. And then once we had validated them, we also compared them to see how they worked in the coaching sample. So did the features we selected actually have stronger predictive power in the coaching set than in the control set? So we can go forward here. Okay, don't shrink. This isn't as painful as it looks. So this is the output from one of the models that performed best for our first outcome, which was the ability to set a meaningful savings goal. And it happens that Lasso was the best performing model for this particular outcome. Okay, so on the far, I guess your left, all we're graphing here is the correlation values for each of the feature sets. Does everybody know what I mean when I talk about a feature set? It just means which specific variables from our WE data actually predict savings outcomes. Okay, so that's the feature set. So there's a minimum threshold in this particular model of 7 features that reached a basic level of correlation, meaning that they successfully predicted whether or not a woman could set a savings goal. But then the model improves up to 32 features. So the best performing version of this model had 32 features that predicted women's savings. But here's the interesting part of that. First of all, 32 features, that might sound like a lot. That's a lot of empowerment things, looking at, control over finances, access to phones, whatever it might be. But consider that we started off with 230 variables, and only 32 of them had any real empirical power to predict whether or not a woman could set a meaningful savings goal. So that means that the vast majority of the features, which we had so lovingly and painstakingly adapted to the specific context of this study with these women talking about savings, were all noise. And anything you added after 32, after the optimum 32 features, start to degrade the performance of the model. So the more we look for, actually the worse, the higher ratio of noise to signal. So this is a flashing red sign if you care about, the empirical aspect of this, telling us that, even if you carefully adapt your indicators to a local context, there is a very high likelihood that what you're measuring is actually noise. It's not giving you a clear picture. So then on the other 2 panels, B and C, all we're showing is how did our optimum feature sets compare to the validation results. So in validation, every one of the models ran 1,000 times and picked 1,000 random sets, and then we compare the correlation value of each of those sets against our optimum set. So we're the dotted lines. The blue panel is our original feature set with 7. The red panel is the 32 features, and you can see that our correlation values are higher than 99% of the randomly selected. So these are pretty well validated feature sets. And I'm not going to dwell on this too much, but yes, we did find that the correlation was better when we ran it in the treatment set than in the validation set. So this tells us that coaching actually did have an observable effect on linking, strengthening the linkage between savings and women's empowerment. So now, I know you guys are like, okay, enough of that. What was the end result of all this? So let's go ahead, one more slide. All right, so where did all of this lead us? How do we summarize this in an actionable way? So keep in mind, we ran 8 models over 3 possible outcomes. So there was a total of 24 times that any individual variable could have been selected. So all we are doing here is just adding up the number of times that any given feature actually appeared in one of our selected models. And so the top performing 5, sorry, I have to move over here a little bit. The number one feature that was selected 21 out of 24 times was household financial responsibilities. And then there were others such as future outlook. In other words, how did the woman describe her economic prospects? The exposure to financial literacy training was a common feature, especially if that training focused on savings. And then another very recurrent construct was women's active concern and desire to take action for their old age. There's an enormous sense of vulnerability when they think about, the years when they're not able to work. And so it ends up being a very important feature in looking at how their empowerment manifests in the course of their savings. Another financial literacy feature here, the ability to compare financial products comes up. And then just sneaking into the top ranks, we have decision-making power. Now, I think what's surprising about this is that some of these do not really feature very prominently in kind of the general literature. And this is not in any way to refute that literature, but it just shows how much things can vary from place to place and how important it is to contextualize your measurements. And then at the bottom of our list, some surprises as well. So it was very rare for time control to come in as a feature. Okay, I'm almost done. And at the very bottom, the preference for digital channels versus physical locations. So yeah, just I guess a word to the wise, be careful. Just one last slide here, because I did promise you there would be some even more actionable insights. So even though we weren't testing the efficacy of coaching, when we saw that it did actually strengthen the statistical relationship between savings and empowerment, we did some further deep diving with other machine learning models to really figure out, well, who was impacted by coaching? And we found some interesting things here. So when it came to the savings outcome of being able to set a meaningful goal, it was actually the more vulnerable women who had a stronger impact of coaching, meaning that coaching helped them summon the wherewithal to set a goal. And these were women who had negative outlooks, who had very little family support, not much of an outlook for their old age. When it comes to actually achieving your savings goal, taking concrete steps towards it, here we saw that coaching led to actual deposits, mainly among women who were already somewhat empowered. They were already more knowledgeable. They were already less vulnerable. I guess this isn't too surprising. And then when it comes down to control over savings, again, this is where the vulnerability measures come into view again. And we saw that the women who had no or very little financial education and had never been to a savings related training were the ones who were most affected by coaching in terms of their ability to use the savings as they intended. Anyway, there's a whole lot more. If you'd like to, the study is now published on the BRAC website. I'd be happy to take any questions. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much. We're not doing very well for time, so maybe we'll just take very brief questions if there are any. Otherwise, we obviously have lunch and the rest to interact and ask questions. But let's see if there are any questions. Okay, if there's yes, please.
Thank you very much. My question is very brief and it has to do with the target population. What was the criteria you used in identifying those women?
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Want to go for that?
Sure.
Yeah, so we were sampling from women that were within a certain distance of the branch of the bank so that they could have access to the account if they needed. But other than that, we didn't stratify the sample by any specific criteria. So, education, income level, et cetera, none of those factors came into play in the targeting.
So if there are no other questions, I think we'll break for lunch. But I think what we have is kind of three really interesting presentations on sort of measurements and concepts, and I think I think sets us up well for the next panel, which is going to be how do we move from measurement to impact. So I think with that, I would like to conclude this session and hand over to our MC.